The room went quiet in a way that didn't belong to a celebration. "I didn't realize they let officers shop at gas stations now," Richard said, lifting his glass just enough to draw attention, but not enough to seem obvious about it. His eyes didn't leave my wrist. "That watch. It's almost impressive how cheap it looks." A few people chuckled, not loudly, just enough. I didn't respond. Because 2 hours later, a man who had commanded entire divisions would stare at that same watch like he'd seen a ghost, and everything in that room would shift. But in that moment, under the soft chandelier light and polite conversation, I just sat there and let the silence do its work. Veterans Day dinners at Richard Halverson's house weren't really about veterans. They were about image. The table was set with precision heavy silverware polished to the point where you could see your reflection in it, crystal glasses aligned perfectly with the edge of the linen runner. There were small American flags placed discreetly between the centerpieces, just visible enough to signal respect without disrupting the aesthetic. Everything about it felt curated, including the people. Most of the guests were business associates, donors, or friends who liked to be seen supporting the right things. A few had served years ago, most had not. But they all wore the tone well-measured, respectful, careful not to say anything too real. I sat halfway down the table to Richard's right, but not close enough to be included in his conversations unless he allowed it. My husband Daniel sat across from me. He gave me a small look when his father made the comment about my watch, something between apology and warning. Let it go. I had planned to. I wore my dress uniform that evening, not for them, but because it felt right. Veterans Day had always meant something specific in my family. It wasn't a performance. It was memory. The fabric sat clean against my shoulders, the lines sharp, every insignia exactly where it belonged. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to be. It carried weight in quieter ways. Unlike the watch. It was simple. Stainless steel. No brand visible. No shine beyond what came from being cared for over time. It didn't match the room. It didn't try to. And it definitely didn't belong in Richard's world. He noticed it the second I walked in. At first, it was just a glance, then a second one longer. By the time we were seated, he had already decided what it meant. Cheap. Out of place. Embarrassing. Dinner moved forward as expected. Conversations about markets, real estate, a brief detour into politics that stayed safely on the surface. Every now and then, someone would turn to me with the same question phrased slightly differently. "So which branch?" "Army," I said. "How long have you been in?" "A while." They nodded like they understood something. Most didn't. Richard, however, wasn't satisfied with general answers. "So what do you actually do?" he asked at one point, cutting through a conversation about investment portfolios without waiting for a pause. "I mean, rank, role, something concrete." There it was. Not curiosity. Evaluation. I set my fork down gently before answering. "I serve where I'm assigned." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That vague, huh? Daniel shifted in his seat. "Dad." "No, I'm just trying to understand," Richard said, still looking at me. "We're all being open here." Open. The word hung there for a second longer than it should have. I could have answered differently. I could have given him something more specific, something that would have satisfied the room and redirected the conversation. But that wouldn't have been honest either. So I met his gaze calm. Some parts of the job don't translate well over dinner. A few people laughed lightly, unsure of which side to take. Richard leaned back in his chair, tapping his glass once with his finger. "Fair enough. Still, you'd think they'd at least issue you something better than that." He nodded toward my wrist again. This time the attention followed. I felt it, the subtle shift, as eyes moved one by one, pretending not to stare. I didn't cover it. Didn't explain it. Didn't defend it. Because the watch wasn't for them. It had weight, but not the kind they would recognize. Daniel cleared his throat. "It's just a watch, Dad." "Exactly," Richard said, and even then... He let the sentence trail off, but the meaning landed anyway. Even then it wasn't good enough. The rest of the table recovered quickly. Someone changed the subject. Wine was poured. Laughter returned a little louder than before, as if to smooth over the moment. But something had shifted. Not in the room. In me. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something quieter, older. The kind of feeling you learn to carry without showing, because reacting doesn't change anything. It just gives people something else to measure you by. I picked up my fork again and continued eating. Across from me, Daniel watched carefully, like he was waiting for a crack that never came. He wouldn't see one. Not tonight. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere had settled back into its polished rhythm. Richard was in his element again, telling a story about a deal he'd closed years ago, hands moving just enough to emphasize control without seeming theatrical. People leaned in at the right moments, laughed when they were supposed to. Everything looked normal. But every now and then I'd catch someone glancing at my wrist. Curiosity had replaced judgment, but only slightly. They didn't understand why I hadn't explained it. Why I hadn't defended myself. In their world, silence usually meant weakness. They had no frame of reference for anything else. I checked the time once, not out of impatience, but habit. The second hand moved smoothly steady, unaffected by the room around it. Just like it always had. Just like it was designed to. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself the smallest shift in perspective. Because I knew something they didn't. Tonight wasn't over. Not even close. And when the right person walked through that door, the meaning of cheap was going to change. Completely. The knock at the door didn't sound urgent, but it carried a different kind of weight. Not loud, not insistent, just deliberate. Richard paused mid-sentence, one hand still hovering above his wine glass. For a fraction of a second, something like irritation crossed his face. His evening had been running exactly on schedule, and unexpected interruptions weren't part of that design. "I'll get it," one of the staff members said quickly, already moving. But Richard was already standing. "No, it's fine," he replied, smoothing the front of his jacket as if the moment needed to be corrected before it fully formed. "I'm expecting someone." That alone shifted the room. Expecting someone this late without mentioning it earlier meant the person mattered. Conversations softened, then faded. Chairs didn't move, but attention did. You could feel it tilt toward the entryway like a compass needle finding north. I didn't turn right away. I had learned a long time ago that moments reveal themselves more clearly when you don't chase them. Instead, I took a slow sip of water and listened. The door opened, a brief exchange, lowered voices respectful, then a pause. And then footsteps. Measured, even, unhurried in a way that didn't ask for space but always received it. When I finally looked up, the room had already changed. He wasn't dressed to impress. No medals, no uniform. Just a dark suit, well-fitted but understated. Silver hair cut close, shoulders still carrying the memory of decades in command, even without the insignia to declare it. People recognized him, some immediately, others a second later, but the effect was the same. They straightened. Not dramatically, just enough. General Carter, Richard said, stepping forward with a smile that felt more genuine than anything he had shown all evening. "I wasn't sure you'd make it." "I wasn't either," the general replied, his voice calm, almost quiet, but it felt like the right night to show up. There was a brief handshake, firm, but not performative. The kind of contact between men who understood hierarchy without needing to display it. Richard gestured toward the table. "Please join us, we were just finishing dessert." "I won't stay long," the general said, though he stepped further inside. "Just wanted to pay my respects." Respect. The word carried differently when he said it. He moved through the room without urgency, acknowledging a few people with nods, a brief word here and there. No one tried to stop him. No one filled the silence around him with unnecessary conversation. It wasn't intimidation. It was recognition. When his gaze reached me, it didn't linger in the way Richards had earlier, evaluating, categorizing. It registered. Then it moved on. And then, it came back. Subtle, almost imperceptible. But I felt it. His eyes dropped just slightly to my wrist. I didn't move. Didn't adjust my sleeve. Didn't offer context. Because whatever he saw there, it would speak for itself. He didn't react immediately. No sharp intake of breath, no sudden change in posture. Just a pause. The kind that only matters if you know what to look for. Then he stepped closer. "Ma'am," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the table quieted again without being asked to. "Do you mind if I ask you something?" I set my fork down. "Of course." His eyes didn't leave the watch. "Where did you get that?" The question landed differently than Richard's. There was no edge in it, no judgment. Only precision. Around us, the room held still. Even Richard, who had been mid-motion pouring wine, stopped. I could feel Daniel's attention sharpen from across the table, but he didn't speak. No one did. Because something had shifted again. And this time it wasn't subtle. I looked at the general, meeting his gaze fully now. There are moments when you measure your words carefully. This wasn't one of them. "My father," I said simply. For a second, nothing happened. Then something in the general's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. His shoulders, already straight, seemed to lock into place, not out of tension but recognition. His eyes moved from the watch to my face, studying it with a kind of focus that had nothing to do with the room we were in. "Your father," he repeated. "Yes, sir." He nodded once slowly. "What's his name?" The question was quieter this time. Not because he needed to lower his voice, but because the answer mattered. I didn't hesitate. "Michael Reyes." The reaction was immediate but controlled. He didn't step back, didn't raise his voice. But the color in his face shifted just enough to notice. His jaw tightened, not in discomfort, but in something closer to restraint. Behind him, someone shifted in their chair. Another guest cleared their throat softly like they needed to break the tension, but didn't know how. Richard didn't move at all. He was watching now, not the watch, not me, but the general. Trying to understand what he was missing. The general exhaled once slow and measured as if grounding himself before speaking again. "I see," he said. 2 words. But they carried weight. He glanced around the table, not long, not dramatically, but enough to register the room, the people, the setting. Then his eyes returned to me. "He give that to you recently?" he asked. "No, sir," I replied, "a while ago." Another nod. "And you've kept it, all this time?" It wasn't a question. "No reason not to," I said. A flicker of something approval maybe passed through his expression. Then just as quickly it was gone. He straightened slightly and turned his attention back to Richard. "You've got quite a gathering here," he said, tone neutral again. Richard blinked once, caught slightly off guard by the shift. "Yes, just a small dinner. Veterans Day, you know." The general nodded. "I do." Silence stretched for a second. Then 2. The kind of silence that forces people to either fill it or face it. Richard chose to fill it. "Well, I'm glad you came," he said a little too quickly. "It's always an honor." The general looked at him not unkindly but not warmly either. "Is it?" he asked. It wasn't confrontational. But it landed. Richard's smile tightened just slightly. "Of course." Another pause. Then the general inclined his head as if deciding something. "Would you mind if I borrowed her for a moment?" he asked, gesturing lightly toward me. That shifted everything again. Now it wasn't just curiosity. It was focus. Every person at that table understood at least on some level that whatever was happening, it had moved beyond casual conversation. Richard hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. Then he nodded, "Of course, please." I stood smoothing my uniform instinctively. Daniel's eyes met mine, questioning, searching. I gave him a small, steady look in return. "It's fine." The general stepped aside to give me space, then gestured toward the quieter end of the room away from the table, away from the carefully arranged world Richard had built for the evening. As we walked, I could feel the weight of the room behind us, not following, but watching, waiting. Because something had been set in motion and no one there quite understood what it was. Not yet, but they would. The farther we stepped from the table, the quieter the room became, not because the guests had stopped talking entirely, but because whatever they said no longer carried weight. Their voices faded into background noise, replaced by the soft hum of the house, the distant clink of glassware, the steady rhythm of something more controlled. We stopped near the far end of the living room just past the edge of the light. It wasn't a private space in the strict sense anyone could look over if they wanted, but it felt separate enough to matter. The general didn't speak immediately. He turned slightly, positioning himself so he could see both me and the reflection of the dining table in the glass behind us. Old habit. Situational awareness without making a show of it. Then his eyes dropped to my wrist again. "May I?" he asked. I extended my arm without hesitation. He didn't touch the watch right away. Instead, he leaned in, just slightly examining it the way someone reads a line they already understand but want to confirm. Up close, the details were clearer. The brushed steel that had been worn smooth at the edges, the faint hairline scratches that only came from years of use, not neglect, the face plane almost understated to the point of invisibility, no brand name, no decorative markers. But there were things you wouldn't notice unless you knew where to look. A small engraving along the inner edge of the casing, nearly invisible unless the light hit it just right. His gaze found it. Of course it did. He exhaled quietly. "I haven't seen one of these in a long time," he said, more to himself than to me. I said nothing. Because this part didn't need explanation. He straightened, folding his hands loosely in front of him, not rigid, not formal, just controlled. "Your father," he said, voice lower now. He retired. "Yes, sir." "Still around?" I held his gaze. "No, sir." A brief pause. He nodded once. "I'm sorry to hear that." It wasn't a reflexive response. It carried weight, measured, deliberate. "Thank you." Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't uncertain. It was respectful. After a moment, he glanced back toward the dining table. Richard was watching us now, not even pretending otherwise. The rest of the guests were doing their best to appear engaged in conversation, but their attention drifted in our direction every few seconds. The general noticed. Of course he did. He turned back to me. "You planning on explaining that to them?" he asked, nodding subtly toward the watch. There was no pressure in the question. Just curiosity. I shook my head slightly. "No, sir." Another small nod. Good. That might have been the end of it. But he didn't leave. Instead, he shifted his weight as if deciding how much to say and how much to leave unsaid. There are things he said slowly that don't belong in rooms like this. I didn't respond. Because I understood. He studied my face for a moment longer, then gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Not warm, not distant, just acknowledging. You carry it well, he said. It wasn't about the watch. Yes, sir. Another glance toward the table. Richard was still watching. Still trying to calculate. The general's expression changed just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough. Then he turned fully toward me again. I served with men like your father, he said. Didn't always know what they were doing. Didn't always need to. A pause. But when they walked into a room, you paid attention. I felt something shift deep, quiet, steady. Not pride. Something older than that. He didn't talk about it much, I said. They never do. A faint breath of agreement. We stood there for another second, neither of us needing to fill it. Then he stepped back, not abruptly, just enough to signal the moment was closing. I should head out, he said. Yes, sir. He hesitated just briefly. Then in a voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the space between us, he added, They don't know what they're looking at. It wasn't criticism. It wasn't judgment. Just fact. I know, sir. His eyes held mine for a fraction longer. Then he gave a small nod, the kind that carries more than words, and turned. We walked back toward the table together, but not side by side. There was space between us now, deliberate, controlled. By the time we reached the edge of the light again, the room had already adjusted. Conversations straightened, postures reset, smiles returned slightly tighter than before. But the rhythm was off. Just enough. Richard stood as we approached. Well, he said lightly, though the edge was back, everything all right? The general looked at him, not long, not confrontational. Just directly. Yes, he said, everything's clear. Another 2 words. Another shift. Richard searched his face for something, confirmation, explanation, anything that would restore control. He didn't find it. The general reached for his coat, which one of the staff had already brought forward. I won't keep you all any longer, he said, addressing the table now. Thank you for the evening. There were polite responses, gratitude, a few attempts at conversation. He acknowledged them with brief nods but didn't engage. Then he turned back to Richard. Take care of your guests, he said. It sounded simple. But it wasn't. Richard nodded, of course. The general's gaze shifted just once back to me. A fraction of a second. Then he left. The door closed quietly behind him. And for the first time that evening, no one spoke. Not immediately. Because something had been left in the room. Not information. Not explanation. Something heavier. Something that didn't need to be named to be felt. Richard was the first to move. He cleared his throat, adjusting his cuff as if resetting himself. Well, he said, forcing a small laugh. That was unexpected. No one replied. Because now the attention wasn't on my watch. It was on him. On what he had missed. On what he had said earlier when he thought he understood the room. He glanced at me just briefly. Not with the same confidence as before. Not with the same certainty. Just a flicker. Then it was gone. Dessert's getting cold, he added, sitting back down. The line fell flat. People followed anyway because that's what people do in rooms like this. They returned to the script. But the script didn't fit anymore. I took my seat again, folding my hands lightly in front of me. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What did he say? He asked under his breath. I looked at him. Then back at the table. Nothing, I said quietly. It was the truth. Because the most important things, he hadn't said out loud. And that was exactly why they mattered. Dinner ended the way strained evenings usually do, not with a clear conclusion, but with a gradual unraveling. People began to stand a little earlier than necessary. Conversations lost their rhythm. Coats were retrieved with polite efficiency. Handshakes exchanged a second too quickly. No one mentioned what had happened, but no one ignored it either. It sat there unspoken, shaping the space between every word. Richard moved through it all with practiced composure. He thanked each guest, held eye contact just long enough, smiled in a way that suggested control had already been restored. If anyone noticed the slight delay in his responses, or the way his attention drifted mid-sentence, they didn't comment. They wouldn't. Not here. Daniel stayed close to me as the room thinned out. Not hovering, not protective, just present in a way that felt deliberate. You okay? He asked quietly at one point, his voice low enough to disappear into the movement around us. I'm fine. He studied my face for a second longer, like he was trying to find something beneath the surface. You didn't have to sit through that, he said. I know. Another pause. But you did anyway. I met his eyes, so did you. That settled something between us, not fully but enough. Across the room, Richard was seeing off the last of his guests. His posture remained upright, his tone measured, but there was a subtle shift now. Less certainty, more calculation. When the front door finally closed for the last time, the house exhaled. Silence returned, not the curated kind from earlier, but something quieter, more honest. Richard didn't turn around right away. He stood there for a moment, hand still resting on the edge of the door, as if replaying the evening in his head, searching for a version where things had gone differently. Then he let go. When he faced us again, the room felt smaller. More real. Daniel spoke first. Long night. Richard nodded once. Productive, though. The word didn't quite land. No one challenged it. A beat passed. Then his eyes moved to me. Not directly at first, just a glance, then back again, this time holding. Walk with me, he said. It wasn't a request. But it wasn't an order either. Something in between. Daniel shifted slightly. Dad. It's all right, I said, already stepping forward. I followed Richard down the hallway away from the main room, past the carefully framed photographs and polished surfaces that had felt so intentional just hours ago. Now they looked staged. Like a version of a life that only made sense from a distance. We stopped near his study. He didn't go inside. Instead, he stood just outside the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the frame like he needed a fixed point. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then finally, what was that? Not aggressive. Not defensive. Just direct. I leaned slightly against the wall opposite him, keeping my posture relaxed. What do you mean? He exhaled through his nose, a faint sign of restraint. Don't do that. You know exactly what I mean. Silence stretched between us, not tense, just measured. He watched me, waiting. Expecting. For an explanation. For something he could categorize, analyze, reduce. I didn't give it to him. It was a conversation, I said simply. With a retired 4-star general who doesn't just have conversations at dinner tables like this, Richard replied sharper now, but not losing control. He looked at you like he recognized something, and then he leaves without explaining any of it. A pause. That doesn't just happen. No, I said, it doesn't. He studied me, searching for cracks. For ego, for defensiveness, for anything he could use to re-establish ground. He didn't find it. His gaze dropped briefly to my wrist. The watch. The same object he had dismissed hours earlier. Is it worth something, he asked? There it was. Not curiosity. Value. I followed his gaze, then looked back at him. Yes. How much? The question came too quickly. I shook my head slightly. That's not the kind of value it has. A flicker of frustration crossed his face. Everything has a number. Not everything. Another pause. Longer this time. He straightened, crossing his arms loosely, not closed off, just holding position. That man, he said, choosing his words more carefully, now reacted like he'd seen something rare, something important. He looked at me again, more directly this time. So I'll ask you once, and I'd appreciate a straight answer. A beat. Who are you really? The question hung in the air. Not hostile. Not accusatory. But heavier than anything he had said all night. I held his gaze. Calm, steady? The same person I was at dinner, I said. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters. His jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger. In adjustment. Because the usual approaches weren't working. You're in my house, he said quietly, at my table, around people who expect a certain level of transparency. And you got it, I replied. You just didn't recognize it. That landed. Not hard. But deep. He looked away for the first time, just briefly toward the study behind him, then back again. When he spoke next, his voice had changed. Less sharp. More grounded. I may have misjudged you, he said. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was movement. I didn't rush to fill the space after it. Didn't soften it. Just let it stand. He glanced at the watch again, then back to my face. That belonged to your father, he said. Yes. And the general knew him. Yes. A small nod. He took that in. Processed it. Then asked more quietly. Was he someone important? I considered the question for a second. Then answered truthfully. He was someone who did his job. Richard held my gaze. Waiting for more. There wasn't any. After a moment, something in his posture shifted. Subtle. But real. The edge of certainty gone. Replaced by something less comfortable. Respect. Not fully formed. But there. I shouldn't have said what I did, he said finally. It wasn't dramatic. Didn't come with emphasis. But it was clear. And it was enough. For the watch, he added almost as an afterthought. I nodded once, I know. Another silence. This one, different. Not tense. Not unresolved. Just quiet. He stepped back slightly, giving the moment space to end without forcing it. We'll have breakfast in the morning, he said, before you head out. It sounded like logistics. But it wasn't. I understood what he meant. I'll be there. He nodded. Then turned into his study, closing the door softly behind him. I stood there for a second longer, then turned back toward the main room. Daniel was waiting. Leaning against the edge of the table, arms crossed, watching the hallway. What happened? He asked. I walked past him, reaching for my coat. Nothing, I said. He frowned slightly. That's twice you've said that tonight. I slipped my arm through the sleeve, adjusting it calmly. That's because it's true. He studied me for another second, then slowly something in his expression eased. Not confusion. Understanding. Or at least the beginning of it. Because sometimes, the most important things that happen don't look like anything at all. Morning light doesn't ask permission. It comes in quietly through edges of curtains, across polished surfaces, settling into corners that looked different the night before. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, the house had already shifted again. The tension from dinner wasn't gone, but it had changed shape, less sharp, more reflective. Richard was already there. Not in a suit this time, no jacket, no tie, just a pressed shirt sleeves rolled once at the forearm, coffee in hand. He stood by the counter looking out the window like he had been there for a while. He didn't turn when I walked in. Coffee, he asked. Yes, thank you. He poured it without asking how I took it. Black. I accepted the cup, the heat settling into my hands in a way that felt grounding. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable, it just didn't need to be filled. Daniel hadn't come down yet. That felt intentional. Richard finally turned, leaning lightly against the counter across from me. No performance this time, no audience, just two people standing in a room that didn't require anything from them. I've been thinking about last night, he said. I figured. A faint breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. I built that dinner to go a certain way, he continued. Every detail, who sits where, who talks to who, what gets said, and what doesn't. His eyes met mine. And then something small shifted it. He glanced briefly at my wrist. The watch. Still there, same as always. Funny thing is, he said I thought I understood what that shift was. I didn't respond. Because I knew what he meant. At first I assumed it was him, he added. The general, his reaction, the way the room responded to him. A pause. But that wasn't it. He let that sit for a second before continuing. It was you. Not dramatic. Not heavy. Just clear. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle before answering. I didn't do anything. That's exactly it, he said. No hesitation this time. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't explain. You didn't try to win the room back. He shook his head slightly. In my world, that reads as weakness. Another pause. I'm starting to understand it isn't. I set the cup down gently on the counter. My father used to say something, I said. He said if something matters enough, you don't spend time proving it to people who aren't in a position to understand it. Richard listened without interrupting. He didn't mean that in an arrogant way, I added. He meant it, practically. Energy is limited. You use it where it counts. Richard nodded, slowly absorbing it. That watch, he said after a moment, it's not about money. Number. It's not about status. No. Another pause. Then what is it? I looked down at it, not for effect, not for explanation, just because it was there. It's a reminder, I said. Of what? I thought about that for a second. Not searching for an answer, just choosing the right one. That there are things worth carrying quietly. The words settled between us. Richard didn't react immediately. He looked at the watch again, but differently now, not measuring, not judging. Trying to understand. And the general, he said, he recognized that. Yes. Without you saying a word. Yes. A slow exhale. I've spent most of my life believing that if something matters, you make sure people see it, he said. You put it on the table. You define it before anyone else can. I nodded once. That works, in certain rooms. He gave a small, almost reluctant smile, and not in others. Exactly. Silence returned, but this time it felt complete. Not waiting for anything. Just there. After a moment, Richard straightened slightly, not back into the man from last night, but into something steadier. I owe you an apology, he said. This time it wasn't partial. Not for the watch. Not for a comment. For the assumption behind it. I judged you based on what I understand, he continued, and I didn't consider that there might be things outside of that. I held his gaze. You did what you always do, I said. You assessed what was in front of you. Yes, he replied, but I didn't look long enough. That mattered more than the apology itself. I nodded once, then you're already doing better than most. A faint breath of something relief maybe passed through his expression. Daniel's footsteps sounded in the hallway, then slow, unhurried. The moment shifted but didn't disappear. Richard picked up his coffee again, taking a small sip before speaking. You're welcome here, he said. Not because of last night, not because of who your father was. He paused. Because of how you handled it. I didn't thank him. Didn't need to. I understand, I said. Daniel stepped into the kitchen, glancing between us like he was trying to read the space. You two look peaceful, he said cautiously. Richard huffed a quiet breath. Don't get used to it. But there was no edge behind it. Daniel looked at me. I gave him a small nod. It's fine. He didn't ask anything else. We had breakfast together, simple quiet, without the performance of the night before. No one mentioned the general, no one brought up the watch. They didn't need to. Because the meaning of it had already done what it was supposed to do. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Later, as I stepped outside, the air felt different. Clearer. Not because anything had changed in the world, but because something had settled. I adjusted my sleeve slightly, the edge of the watch catching the light for just a second before disappearing again beneath the fabric. Right where it belonged. There would be other rooms like that one. Other people who measured value in ways that didn't account for things like this. That was fine. Because not everything needs to be understood to matter. And not everything that matters needs to be seen. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been underestimated, misread, or quietly dismissed, then you already understand more than most. I'd like to hear your perspective. Where are you watching from? What's something you carry that others might not recognize at first glance? Share it below. And if you believe in stories about quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself, subscribe and stay with us. There's more ahead.